I'm George Denison, broadcaster of 4Player Network, and these are my top 10 games of 2016. Playdead's Limbo is easily one of my favourite indie games of all time, and I've been eagerly awaiting their follow-up, Inside, ever since it was announced what feels like ages ago now. Inside is yet another atmospheric, set-piece driven platformer, and shows yet again that Playdead are the masters of wordless storytelling and world building. Through their impressive audio design and distinctive art direction, and without using a single line of dialogue, they've created a more interesting and fleshed out world than many games manage with bucket loads of exposition and flavour text. What Playdead do so well is create super intense moments when it feels like you're only narrowly escaping death by a fraction of a second in these perfectly choreographed platforming moments, like when you're jumping back and forth over a fence, frantically trying to yank the bars off a door while being chased by dogs, or the whole sequence with the underwater creature. Limbo had all this too, with its giant spider and traps. But what Inside has that Limbo doesn't is an incredible payoff at the end with an empowering but horrifying final sequence, which is absolutely worth the price of admission alone. I won't spoil anything, but it's an incredible use of the game's physics engine and it's just something else. Definitely not something you'll forget in a hurry. Inside is also really well paced across its short playtime, and it nicely balances its intensity with some quieter and more reflective moments, where the camera pans back and allows you to just drink in the scenery. The actual puzzle solving is kind of basic and, if I'm perfectly honest, sometimes a little boring. I think it suffers slightly from having some games come out over its protracted development cycle, like the Swapper, that are just as atmospheric but far more interesting from a puzzle design standpoint. But having said that, Inside definitely has enough memorable moments and set pieces that have stuck with me throughout the year to make this worthy of my top 10. Ah, Disasterpiece. It seems as though games featuring your music are just destined to end up in my end-of-year lists. First there was Fez back in 2012, then Runner 2 in 2013, and now Hyper Light Drifter in 2016. So as you might expect, I'm a huge fan of this game's sound design and music, which like Fez has this retro but slightly dreamlike vibe, and adds so much to the game's atmosphere. But of course it's more than just pretty sound effects and gorgeous pixel art. Hyper Light Drifter takes the fun exploration part of old 2D top-down Zeldas and fixes what I don't think has aged all that well in those games, the combat. Here combat is tight and challenging and neatly merges melee combat and twin-stick shooting. The controls are really responsive and I love the drifting mechanic, which comes with a nice learning curve and adds a zippiness and manoeuvrability to the combat, which was always lacking in the old 2D Zeldas. Plus, it doubles up as a great traversal mechanic, which makes the world all the more fun to explore once you've mastered it. I also have to say that I love the world itself. I couldn't really follow what was going on in the story, but the amazing pixel art and soundtrack that I talked about earlier just makes it such a cool place to explore anyway. And it's full of secrets. I probably missed about half of them. This game has some really great boss battles as well. I did have some frustration with the slightly confusing world map, but on the whole I really enjoyed Hyper Light Drifter. It's going in at number 9. George Orwell's 1984 is one of my all-time favourite novels, so when I spotted an indie game called Orwell that is themed around state surveillance, it naturally piqued my interest. This one is a real hidden gem. If you're not familiar with it, the game is about trying to get to the bottom of a terrorist attack by snooping on people's social media accounts, phone conversations and private online data. If you enjoyed the dystopian storytelling through day job concept of Papers, Please, or investigating a mystery through sifting through information like with Her Story, I thoroughly recommend checking it out. I make these comparisons with some heavy caveats though. Unlike Her Story, this game is pretty linear, and it's probably closer to something like a visual novel than a traditional game. But Orwell still manages to tell a gripping story in an interesting and interactive way. Because the authorities will only use the information you pass on to them to incriminate suspects, you're presented with these tough choices around how you shape suspect profiles. Information can easily be taken out of context and can often shape the story in ways that you might not have intended if you aren't careful. The game also has this slick fictional browser interface and low poly art style that really immerses you in the investigation. As a storytelling experience, it had me hooked across the 7 to 8 hours I spent with it. I think it's well worth checking out. The problem with Stephen's Sausage Roll is that even though it's a brilliant puzzle game, it's also a very difficult sell. Firstly, it's called Stephen's Sausage Roll. It sounds like one of those joke meme games. Graphically, it looks ugly as hell in screenshots, and the Steam page tells you basically nothing about the game itself. To top it all off, the game is sold at a fairly pricey £22, with no way of knowing how much content the game has going into it. But, if you're a crazy person like me and all of this doesn't put you off, and you do decide to pick it up, you get to experience a puzzle game that's actually kind of brilliant. Basically, Stephen's Sausage Roll is about grilling sausages by rolling them around grid-based islands. You have to cook each sausage perfectly without burning them or pushing them into the water. This is much harder than it sounds. This game really drops you in at the deep end with no simple puzzles to ease you into its abstract concepts of movement, planning and spatial awareness. These puzzles are hard right from the start, and only get harder as you go along. In fact, I bounced right off the game initially because I couldn't figure out what the game wanted from me at all with some of the puzzles in the first area alone. But I went back to the game later in the year and persevered, and at some point it clicked. And when a puzzle clicks in this game, when you finally get it, it's so satisfying in a way that very few puzzle games are. And all the mechanics in this game are discovered through experimentation rather than the game telling you what to do. You get these brilliant moments of epiphany where you discover something and go, oh, I can do that? And it's something that you've been able to do all along, but the environment and puzzle structure just hasn't allowed for it. Puzzle-wise, this game is all killer and no filler, with every puzzle having some neat little twist to it that you have to figure out through lateral thinking. You'll encounter so many puzzles where you go, okay, I don't get it, this has to be impossible, only to crack it half an hour later in some really clever way. And if you're worried about the value proposition of this game, my Steam clock shows 30 hours and I'm still only about 3/4 of the way through. This game might not be for everyone, but it's definitely for me. I love hard puzzles, I love sausages, I love Stephen's Sausage Roll. I'm a big fan of psychedelic rhythm action games like Rez and Dyad and Child of Eden, and Thumper is another one that I'm happy to add to that list. It doesn't have the upbeat vibe of something like Rez though. Thumper is much more claustrophobic and nightmarish. It's been described as a rhythm violence game, which seems pretty apt as you're stuck on this track having to anticipate sudden turns at breakneck speeds and hit complex notes with only this aggressive industrial noise music to guide you. If you smash into more than 2 obstacles, you're set back to the last checkpoint, which makes Thumper bloody hard, but that's what I love about it. It's intense and fast, and even though it technically plays like a rhythm action or runner type game, it gives me the same sense of exhilaration that I used to get from the old F-Zero games, which is a feeling I've been craving for many years now. The game controls like a dream, and I love the sonic feedback you get, particularly the metallic thwack when you make a perfect turn. Thumper also has a great New Game Plus mode that I've become addicted to, where the music speeds up the more consecutive notes you can hit, which adds to the intensity even more. It's a game that I still want to go back to next year to continue to master. It's a shame I didn't get to experience it in VR, but even without it, it's still definitely one of my favourites from this year. I'm not normally into dungeon crawlers, so I wasn't sure if I would get on with Darkest Dungeon, but after having played it compulsively for 40 hours now, I can safely say that it's been one of the year's highlights. This is another game where I really enjoyed it for its challenge, as you have to micromanage tight resources throughout each dungeon, as well as stress meters, which are constantly ticking down along with your light sources and supplies, and cause characters to develop afflictions if you let their stress get too high. I love how your journey through each dungeon gradually escalates. I'd start with a full party of healthy explorers, and by the final room, end up with one dude on his last sliver of health, but has become paranoid and refuses to be healed, and another who has snapped under the pressure and is shouting verbal abuse at anyone who misses an attack. It's a great system that adds an entertaining level of chaos and tension into later combat encounters. It's annoying to lose heroes, particularly when you've spent quite a bit of time levelling them up, but being able to upgrade your base with heirlooms means you still get a sense of progress, even if you get knocked back to the start. Also, I like how the game encourages you to experiment with different class combinations, which stop the game feeling too repetitive. I still haven't reached the final dungeon, and I normally don't like to put games on these lists that I haven't finished, but for some reason Darkest Dungeon really satisfies the inner micromanager in me, and I can totally see myself playing more of this in 2017. Bullet time isn't exactly a new concept in games, and I've always enjoyed it in games like Max Payne, Fear, Call of Juarez, but I've never seen it used quite like it is in Superhot. This is the shooter where time moves when you move, or to put it another way, everything slows right down when you stop, which almost makes this feel like a hybrid of a shooter and a turn-based game, particularly when you have to carefully plan each move you make because, like in something like Hotline Miami, one bullet will kill you and you have to make every shot count. As you can probably see from the footage, in motion this is simply one of the most stylish games I've played, with its stark white environments and bright red bullet trails. But it's just as cool to play as it is to watch. Smashing apart red glass dudes like human piñatas is so satisfying, and there's loads of cool things you can do, like slice bullets in half with a katana, or body swap into an enemy and then catch your own weapon in mid-air. You might have heard that Superhot is a short game, and its campaign is only 2 hours long, but I don't think it's fair to hold this against the game when there's a ton of unlockable modes and challenges to complete once the campaign is over. Honestly, I thought the campaign was the weakest aspect of the game. It has some trippy moments, but it came across as trying a bit too hard to be meta and clever, particularly after Pony Island did it much better. I had way more fun spending hours trying to beat my score in the endless modes and challenges. It's maybe light on things like weapons and maps, but if you like the core gameplay as much as I did, then you should definitely get more than just 2 hours of fun out of it. At the end of the day, any game that lets me slice bullets out of the air with a katana is going to end up on my top 10 list. Superhot. It's the most innovative shooter I've played in years. Now to end the string of indie games we've had so far with what, for me, is something of a surprise entry for this list, Uncharted 4. And you might think, George, what are you talking about? How is that a surprise? Everyone loves the Uncharted series. But actually, when I picked up the Nathan Drake collection to play through the Uncharted games for the first time earlier this year, I didn't get on with the first 2 games at all. I mainly took issue with the really repetitive cover-based shooting and the sticky platforming controls. By the time I got to the end of the second game, I was convinced that Uncharted just wasn't a series I was meant to enjoy. But since I had the third game on the disc, I went back to it after taking a break and weirdly ended up enjoying it a lot more, despite having a lot of the same frustrations as the first 2 games. I think they really outdid themselves with the set pieces and took a more open approach to the moment-to-moment encounters that alleviated a lot of the repetition. So coming off the third game, I decided to give the fourth game a spin, and honestly, I thought this one was fantastic. Uncharted 4 has the excellent presentation and cinematic flair that you would expect from Naughty Dog, and the transitions between gameplay and cutscenes seem more seamless to me this time. Plus, this has got to be some of the best motion capture work I've seen in any game. It's definitely closer than ever before to the interactive action movie experience that they're going for. But more than anything, I really feel like the gameplay has improved in a big way, with even more open and vertical combat environments that allow for a mix of stealth and gunplay. I'm trying to put my finger on why I like it so much more, and I think that it really boils down to not feeling like you're stuck behind a piece of wall popping off wave after wave of enemies. I love some of the little touches they've added, like how guards will sometimes grab onto your leg when you pull them off a ledge from underneath, and there's a button prompt to shake them off. Melee combat, which I always felt was a bit crap in all past 3 games, feels so much better and punchier here, with its dynamic use of camera angles. You can tell Naughty Dog have taken some pointers from The Last of Us in this respect. And what is it about jumping on enemies from above and punching them to the ground that just feels so right? I don't know, it's just so satisfying. The gameplay improvements would have been enough for this to earn a spot on my list, but I also think that Naughty Dog have really upped their game in terms of storytelling. The storytelling in the first 3 games was fine in a throwaway Sunday afternoon television film kind of way, but Uncharted 4 has a shot of maturity which gives it a bit of added depth, and some wonderful character-driven sequences like the Crash Bandicoot sequence early on in the game. Uncharted always had great motion capture and performances, but I think the writing here is better than it's been before, and again, makes it feel more like a well-paced interactive movie than just a third-person shooter with some set pieces and pretty cutscenes. I can take or leave Uncharted 4's multiplayer, but its single player has one of the best AAA campaigns I've seen in recent years, so there's definitely a place for it in my top 10. I remember really enjoying what I played of Deus Ex Human Revolution in 2011, but because I hit a roadblock with that terrible first boss, I put the game down for a long time and never really managed to break back into it again. So even though Mankind Divided is something of a 0.5 sequel to Human Revolution, I was still quite excited to get the Human Revolution experience with some of the kinks ironed out and the boss fights removed so I could properly get my teeth into it. In the end, I actually ended up really enjoying Mankind Divided on the whole, mainly because I adore its depiction of future Prague. I found it to be incredibly immersive and stuffed with so many little details that make it feel like a living, breathing place. From the covers of cereal boxes to the giant holographic adverts for antidepressants. It's one of the first games I've played in a while where I found myself just stopping to take in the atmosphere and admire the environment. The gameplay is similar to Human Revolution, which is no bad thing, but with small tweaks and updates to the stealth mechanics that help to make the experience a lot smoother. I enjoyed having the freedom to tackle situations in different and creative ways, some of them pretty hilarious, like how I managed to get out of one firefight by simply running past guards, gulping down about 7 cans of booze that I had managed to hoard in my inventory to keep my health up. Remember how I said that this game removed the annoying bosses from Human Revolution? Well, there is one at the end, and it almost ended the game on a downer, as I had managed to pull off a non-lethal playthrough up until that point. And when I broadcasted this, people in chat were saying, "Oh, you'll have to use brute force on this guy," which I wasn't equipped for at all. But I managed to find some tranquilizer ammo and sneak into a vent and fire a few carefully aimed darts into his face, and I got my pacifist achievement, and goddamn did it feel good. The main story of this game is maybe not the best, but I had fun with all the side missions, and the world itself was just such a cool place to explore. I know some people didn't have such a good time with this game, and it definitely has some issues, but personally I enjoyed it more than enough for it to be worthy of my top 10 list. I've been eagerly awaiting The Witness for years. I think this has been my most anticipated game since 2014. Well, it's finally here, and I'm really glad that it wasn't a disappointment. It's not everybody's cup of tea, and some people see it as just a boring game where you draw lines across grids, but I think it's pretty clever how much variety Jonathan Blow has managed to squeeze out of this one concept across hundreds of puzzles. The fun and challenge of this game is as much about learning the rules of the puzzles as it is about solving the puzzles themselves. I remember feeling overwhelmed when I started exploring and seeing all of these strange symbols and not having a clue what they meant. But gradually you build up an understanding of what everything means, and this game has some of the best aha moments of epiphany in any puzzle game I've played. It's almost like a mental Metroidvania, where you find an area that teaches you a rule or a concept, and then suddenly you realise that you can solve puzzles in another area because you've broadened your understanding of how things work. The island you explore is visually stunning with its rich colour palette, and even though it isn't very big, it's tightly designed with loads of secrets and puzzles within puzzles. I've spent hours in this game obsessing over tiny details like the way windmill blades rotate or how light reflects off different surfaces. I have pages and pages of notebook paper filled with drawings and diagrams from working some of this stuff out. It's exactly the type of puzzle solving I love, where the game isn't holding you by the hand and you're really having to figure out things by yourself. The game has such a crazy level of detail that the shape of a tree or a reflection in the water can tip you off to a puzzle solution if you're observant. I would get stuck on puzzles, but I don't think I ever had to look up a solution. I would just come back to it the next day with a clear head and spot something that I hadn't before, then everything would slot into place. The Witness doesn't have much in the way of a clear story, and I understand how that might frustrate people who want a bit more narrative context from the game. But I found the puzzles and environment alone were worth the asking price. It's one of the most rewarding puzzle games I've played. Even though it came out all the way back in January, I haven't forgotten how much I enjoyed it, and it's my Game of the Year for 2016. I hope you enjoyed my list for my top 10 games of 2016. Honourable mentions go to Devil Daggers and Oxenfree. Those are two really cool games, you should check them out. Let's hope that 2017 is an even better year. Thanks for watching.